You walk into a room and say something. Not loud, not quiet, just normal, and nothing happens. No one turns, no one responds. The conversation keeps moving like you weren't there at all. You were a kid who learned that being in a room wasn't the same as being seen, that speaking didn't guarantee being heard, that even when you were right there, you could somehow still be invisible. And here's the strange part. You weren't screaming for attention. You weren't acting out. You were just there, doing what kids do, existing, and somehow that wasn't enough to register. So what happens to a child who grows up ignored? And why does that silence follow them, even decades later? First, you weren't too much or not enough. You were a child who needed to be seen, and the adults around you couldn't do that. Not because you were invisible, but because they were looking somewhere else. This isn't about blame. Sometimes parents are overwhelmed. Sometimes they're dealing with their own wounds. Sometimes the house was full, and you were just the quiet one who didn't demand as loudly as the others. But regardless of the reason, the impact was the same. Your brain learned something foundational about how the world works. It learned that your presence doesn't create a response, that mattering isn't automatic, that you have to earn being noticed. And even then, it might not come. When a child is ignored consistently, they start building an internal map of their own significance. And that map says, I am not the main character, I am background, I am optional. This shows up in small, specific ways. You stop volunteering ideas in group settings because you've learned that when you do, people just talk over you. You let others choose the restaurant, the movie, the plan, not because you don't care, but because caring out loud has historically made no difference. You become an expert at reading the room, at adjusting your volume, your energy, your needs to fit what won't disturb anyone. You don't storm out. You don't make scenes. You just fade back. The way you learned to as a kid when fading back was safer than trying again and being reminded that trying didn't work. The ignored child grows up with a particular kind of loneliness. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind. The kind where you can be surrounded by people and still feel like you're watching through glass. Because here's what neglect teaches that other kinds of pain don't. It teaches you that your absence doesn't matter. You weren't yelled at, so there's no anger to process. You weren't hit, so there's no clear wound to heal. You were just not prioritized. And that makes it so much harder to name. You end up in relationships where you give more than you ask for because asking has always felt risky. Not because people will say no, but because they might not hear you at all. And that confirmation, that repeat of the original wound, is unbearable. But here's what nobody tells you. The invisibility you feel isn't a fact. It's an echo. You're not too quiet to matter. You were just around people who didn't know how to see you. Ignored children grow into adults who are terrified of being a bother, who apologize before asking questions, who downplay their needs so efficiently that they sometimes forget they have them. If you're sick, you'll still show up. If you're hurt, you'll say you're fine. Not because you're dishonest, but because the idea that someone would pause their life to care for yours feels on a deep level impossible. And when someone does notice you, really notice you, it can feel overwhelming because you're not used to being the thing someone pays attention to. Part of you waits for them to look away, to get distracted, to move on to someone louder, brighter, easier to see. There's also a specific kind of anger that lives in people who grew up ignored, not the explosive kind, the slow-burning kind. It shows up when someone interrupts you for the third time in a conversation, when your idea gets credited to someone else, when people forget you were even in the room. And the anger isn't just about now, it's about every single time this happened before. Every time you were 12 or 8 or 15 and nobody turned around. But because you learned early that expressing that anger changes nothing, you swallow it. You tell yourself it's not a big deal, that you're being sensitive, that other people have it worse, and the anger stays, quiet and patient, somewhere in your chest. Here's what all of this shares. Being ignored as a child doesn't just hurt in the moment. It teaches you that you're someone the world can function without, that your emotions, your thoughts, your presence are all fundamentally skippable. And you carry that lesson everywhere, into friendships where you're always the one who reaches out first, into jobs where you don't negotiate because you're grateful someone wanted you at all, into relationships where you're so used to not being chosen that when someone does choose you, you don't trust it. The ignored child becomes the invisible adult, not because they want to be, but because visibility feels dangerous. Because being seen means risking being looked past. Again, so if you grew up ignored, if you learned to be small, to not ask for too much, to make yourself easy to overlook, know this: you are not too much. You are not too little. You are not the problem that didn't get solved because you weren't loud enough about it. You were a child who needed to be seen, and the people around you couldn't do that. That wasn't a referendum on your worth. It was a failure of attention that had nothing to do with whether you deserved it. You don't have to stay small to stay safe. You don't have to keep making yourself easy to miss. You're allowed to be seen, not because you've earned it, not because you've been quiet long enough, just because you're here, and you always mattered, even when no one turned around. If you saw yourself in even one part of this video, this channel is for you. Subscribe and start understanding the human mind in a way most people never explain, with depth, clarity, and zero judgment. Every week, on a new insight that might change the way you see yourself and others.